Imagine a world without yesterday and tomorrow. Imagine waking up each morning with no memory of whether you hunted 3 days ago or 3 seasons ago. Imagine watching the moon complete its dance across the sky 17 times and feeling absolutely certain that it had appeared 18 times. This was the world of Keth Mor, a man whose desperation would eventually reshape human civilization forever. It was 23,000 years ago, in a valley nestled between 2 mountain ranges that would one day be called the Caucasus. The climate had begun to shift. Winters grew harsher, summers more unpredictable. Keth Mor's tribe, the Kalai people, faced a crisis that seemed impossibly abstract compared to their daily struggles for food and shelter. They were losing control of time itself. Keth Mor was not a hunter like his brothers. He was what his people called a memory keeper, the designated elder responsible for maintaining knowledge. He knew which plants were edible in which season, which animals migrated when, where the freshest water flowed during drought. His tribe depended on this knowledge. But Keth Mor carried a burden that no one else seemed to understand. He was beginning to forget. The problem started small. During his 37th winter, or was it his 39th? Keth Mor made a critical error. He led the tribe to gather certain berries that would not ripen for another moon cycle, wasting 3 days of precious energy. The hunters returned empty-handed while their bellies ached with hunger. Another time he miscalculated when the deer would pass through their territory, causing them to miss the single best hunting opportunity of the year. His mistakes were becoming more frequent, more dangerous. One fateful evening, as his tribe sat around a dying fire, Keth Mor's grandson asked him a simple question. "Grandfather, how many winters have you lived?" Keth Mor opened his mouth to answer and found himself utterly paralyzed. He genuinely did not know. He had lost count somewhere between the countless cold seasons and endless summers. His grandson, barely old enough to speak clearly, laughed nervously. The other tribe members exchanged uncertain glances. That night, Keth Mor did not sleep. He lay on his bed of animal fur, staring at the stars above the smoke hole in their shelter. The stars, they never forgot their patterns. The moon, it cycled with perfect regularity. Yet humans, the masters of the earth, could not even count their own lives. The realization struck him like a spear. If he could not count, his knowledge meant nothing. If knowledge could not be preserved, civilization itself would be impossible. Keth Mor made a decision that would alter the course of human history. He would create a tool to catch time itself. Part 2, the birth of notation. The next morning, Keth Mor did something completely unprecedented. He stopped hunting. This alone shocked his tribe. A man who abstained from the hunt was either dying or mad. While his brothers sharpened their spears and prepared for the day's expedition, Keth Mor sat outside their shelter with an unusual collection of objects. He had gathered 13 smooth stones, each roughly the size of a child's fist. He began arranging them in a line. 1, 2, 3. He moved his finger along the stones as he counted aloud, his voice steady but urgent. His grandson watched with intense curiosity. "Why are you playing with rocks, old one?" his daughter asked, concern etched across her weathered face. "I am not playing," Keth Mor replied, his eyes never leaving his arrangement. "I am catching time." This was the moment of the calendar's conception, though no one yet understood its significance. Keth Mor had made a breakthrough that his people did not possess a language sophisticated enough to articulate the principle of external memory. By creating a physical representation of passing units, he could reference objective reality outside the fallible fortress of human memory. But 13 stones told him nothing. He needed a system, a structure that captured the fundamental rhythms of nature. Keth Mor spent days and weeks in observation, his mind working at a level of abstraction that his tribe had never before encountered. He watched the moon. The moon was perfect. It disappeared and reappeared with perfect consistency. He began to mark each complete lunar cycle with a notch on a bone. He used a sharp flint stone and created a long bone tool that bore 29 distinct marks, one for each day he observed between the moon's rebirth. When the moon appeared again, he started a new bone. But here was Keth Mor's true genius. He did not stop with the moon. He continued his observations, watching as seasons turned. He noticed something that would seem obvious to modern humans, but represented a revolutionary insight to Keth Mor. The rhythm of seasons matched a pattern. Winter was cold, spring followed, summer brought warmth, autumn brought change. Then winter returned. These 4 patterns repeated, and they aligned with specific behaviors in animals and plants. He began creating additional bones, each marked differently. 1 bone for cold seasons, 1 for warm seasons, 1 bone for hunting seasons, 1 for gathering seasons. He carved symbols, crude pictures of deer to mark when they migrated, drawings of sun representing days, crescents representing lunar cycles. His tribe thought he was delusional when they returned from a successful hunt and found him obsessively carving bones instead of preparing meat. Some wanted to exile him. But Keth Mor's daughter, a woman named Sela with inherited intelligence, recognized something profound in her father's work. She began to help him, bringing him bones, collecting ideas, watching the patterns with him. "What is the purpose?" she asked one evening. "To make memory concrete," Keth Mor explained. "To put time outside ourselves so we can see it." Sela understood. She had experienced her own failures of memory times when she had forgotten which caves held which minerals, when she had miscalculated which plants were safe to eat. She embraced her father's obsession. Part 3. The system emerges. Months passed. Keth Mor's innovation evolved from scattered bones and stones into something approaching an actual system. He created a designated area in the shelter, a sacred space where the bones were arranged in specific orders. To other members of the tribe, it looked like the arrangement of a shaman's magical objects. To Keth Mor and Sela, it represented something far more revolutionary, a storage device for information that existed outside human memory. The breakthrough came during the 2nd year of his work. A younger tribe member named Orek, only 18 winters old but curious beyond measure, approached Keth Mor while he worked. Instead of dismissing him as others did, Keth Mor decided to teach. "Show me what you see," Keth Mor said. Orek examined the bones with fresh eyes. "There are patterns," he said slowly. "This bone has more marks than this one. This one has different symbols." "Exactly!" Keth Mor's weathered face brightened with rare enthusiasm. "Each bone tells a different part of time's story. This bone," he lifted the longest one, "captures full cycles. When all these marks are filled, when this bone is complete, winter returns to us." Orek grasped the concept with surprising speed. Within weeks, he was helping Keth Mor track observations. More importantly, he began to explain the system to others, translating Keth Mor's abstract genius into practical language that hunters and gatherers could understand. Word of Keth Mor's system began to spread beyond his immediate tribe. When neighbouring groups travelled through their territory, they heard about the old man who had captured time. Some came with scepticism, others came with desperate hope. A tribe from the northern valley had missed the optimal hunting season twice. Their leader, a battle-scarred man named Throck, came to examine Keth Mor's bones personally. Keth Mor explained the system. Throck listened in silence, then asked the question that changed everything. "Can you teach others?" This question forced Keth Mor to confront a limitation of his creation. The bones were beautiful, but they required interpretation. They required an expert who understood the symbols, who had performed the observations, who could translate marks into meaning. For the system to spread, it needed to be more universal, more teachable. Keth Mor made a revolutionary decision. He would create a physical, permanent calendar. Part 4. Carving Forever. Near his shelter, Keth Mor discovered a large stone face created by the mountain itself, a smooth, exposed wall of rock that received direct sunlight most of the day. Here, He began the work that would occupy the final years of his life. Using sharp flint and hammer stones, working with a precision that many who witnessed it considered superhuman, Keth Mor began to carve. He created 12 sections, representing 12 lunar cycles. Within each section, he carved symbols with meticulous detail. Circles within circles represented the moon. Lines radiating from a central point represented the sun. Images of animals appeared in their appropriate seasonal positions. He carved representations of frost for winter, flowing water for spring, tall plants for summer, and falling leaves for autumn. The work took years. Keth Mor's hands became permanently calloused and scarred. His eyesight deteriorated from the constant strain of fine carving. Other members of his tribe initially ridiculed the endeavour. A useful adult male was carving rocks instead of hunting. The waste seemed almost obscene during times of scarcity, but Sela protected her father's work. When he grew too weak to continue, she took up the tools and carved where he directed her. When critics grew too vocal, she reminded the tribe of the disasters that had struck before Keth Mor's innovation. The missed hunting seasons, the gathered poisonous plants, the tribes that had starved because they had miscalculated their resources. The stone calendar grew more sophisticated. Keth Mor added additional elements based on his observations. He realized that astronomical events provided perfect reference points. The longest day of summer, the shortest day of winter, the times when night and day were equal. He tried to incorporate these moments into his calendar, creating a stone-carved astronomical guide. Other innovations emerged from this work. Keth Mor established that there were 365 days in a complete cycle, plus a fraction of a day, though his people did not possess the mathematical concepts to express fractions. Instead, they simply understood that you had to occasionally add an extra day to make the system accurate. He created a method for this adjustment, a system that would not be scientifically perfected for thousands of years, but represented a genius-level insight for his time. One of the most significant innovations came from Orek. After years of working with Keth Mor's system, he proposed something revolutionary. What if different tribes used identical calendar systems? What if every group in the vast territory, hundreds of tribes spanning hundreds of miles, could coordinate their activities around a shared understanding of time? This idea transformed the calendar from a practical tool into a social technology. Suddenly, the possibility of coordinated hunting across tribal boundaries became conceivable. Trade could be planned, religious festivals could be synchronized, knowledge could be transmitted with reference points that every group understood. Part 5. The Transformation. By the time Keth Mor was in his final years, the calendar had fundamentally transformed his society. Hunting success had improved dramatically because coordinated seasonal efforts yielded better results. Trade between tribes had increased because agreements could reference specific times that all parties understood. Young people could be trained in agricultural principles because knowledge could be transmitted through time. A youth trained at spring planting could teach the next generation at the following spring planting. Most profoundly, something almost spiritual had emerged around the calendar. The stone wall that Keth Mor had carved had become sacred space. Tribes began to travel significant distances to consult it, to align their activities with its cycles. Priests and shamans began to assign spiritual significance to different parts of the cycle. The spring equinox became a time of renewal. The winter solstice became a time of survival and testing. Summer became a time of abundance and growth. Keth Mor had not intended to create religion, but his calendar provided religion with a framework. For the first time, large groups of humans could celebrate shared experiences at synchronized times. For the first time, humans could plan their lives not just around immediate survival, but around future possibilities. The practical applications continued to multiply. Storage of food could be optimized based on seasonal needs. Herds could be followed with precision. Weather patterns could be anticipated. Medicine men began to notice that certain plants were most potent at particular times of year. knowledge that could now be preserved and transmitted accurately. A turning point came when Keth Mor's system prevented a potential disaster. A young tribe leader named Mal Keth, bearing a name that honoured the great innovator, used the calendar to realise that an abnormally harsh winter was approaching 3 seasons ahead of time. Based on this prediction, his people gathered extra food storage, prepared shelters more thoroughly, and gathered additional furs. When the harsh winter arrived exactly as the calendar had predicted, Malketh's tribe survived with minimal losses, while other tribes in the region suffered devastating casualties. This event crystallized the calendar's importance. Suddenly it was not merely a practical tool, but a source of almost supernatural predictive power. The tribes began to recognize Keth Mor as more than an innovator. He was a sage, a man who had captured something divine, a human who had learned to read the mind of the gods. Part 6. The Legacy Multiplied. Keth Mor did not live to see the full flowering of his creation's influence. He died during his 47th winter, his body worn out by decades of intense observation and carving. But he left behind something that would prove far more durable than flesh, a framework for understanding time that would persist for thousands of years. After his death, his stone calendar became a pilgrimage site. Tribes travelled from territories a month's journey away to consult it. Scribes, a new profession that emerged specifically because of the calendar system, maintained additional stone calendars carved to match Keth Mor's original pattern. Knowledge that had once been hoarded by individual memory keepers became standardized and shareable. The calendar's influence began to spread laterally into other domains of knowledge. Medicine keepers used it to track remedies and their efficacies. Agricultural societies began to emerge, based partly on the ability to plan planting and harvest with unprecedented precision. Military leaders used the calendar to coordinate attacks across vast territories. Trade routes became more complex because trading partners could schedule exchanges with confidence. Most significantly, the calendar created the foundation for written language. Before Keth Mor's innovation, humans did not see the need for symbols that could store information persistently. Spoken language was sufficient for immediate communication. But the calendar required symbols, representations that could encode meaning persistently. Other societies, learning of Keth Mor's achievement, began to wonder what else could be encoded. Could plant knowledge be encoded? Could hunting strategies? Could songs and stories? Within a few centuries of Keth Mor's death, the first true writing systems began to emerge in various human societies. Most historians do not draw a direct line between Keth Mor's calendar and later writing systems, but the conceptual leap from oral knowledge to encoded persistent knowledge was absolutely pioneered by the calendar. The calendar also transformed how humans thought about themselves. For the first time, people could measure their individual lives against an objective standard. A person could say, "I have lived 40 winters," with absolute confidence. Genealogies became traceable. Historical events could be placed in relation to each other. The very concept of history events ordered in time, causally connected, emerged from the possibility of tracking time objectively. Part 7. The Vision realized. 500 years after Keth Mor's death, a vast trading network had emerged across the entire Eurasian continent, united partly by shared calendar systems descended from his original innovation. Caravans moved with confidence across thousands of miles because trading partners could coordinate meetings using shared calendar references. Astronomical observations from different regions could be compared because they referenced the same calendar system. Diseases could be tracked across large populations because outbreaks could be placed in temporal context. Religious practices had evolved in fascinating ways based on the calendar's framework. Different cultures assigned different spiritual meanings to different seasons, but all of them used Keth Mor's fundamental insight, dividing the year into meaningful cycles, as the foundation for their spiritual practice. Temples were built to align with astronomical events that Keth Mor had identified. Festivals were coordinated across vast regions. Agricultural civilization, which would eventually become the foundation of all complex human societies, was fundamentally enabled by the calendar. Farmers needed to know precisely when to plant and when to harvest. Seasonal variations across different locations required careful calculation. Storage systems needed to be planned based on anticipated consumption through the year. All of this became possible only because Keth Mor had created a reliable system for tracking time. The calendar also changed how humans thought about themselves philosophically. Before the calendar, time was largely experienced as a cyclical phenomenon. Seasons returned, celestial events repeated, generations succeeded each other. The calendar maintained this cyclical understanding but added a linear dimension. You could count how many cycles had passed. This created a new conception of time as simultaneously cyclical and progressive, a paradox that would occupy philosophers for thousands of years. Part 8. The Unknown Revolutionary. What is most remarkable about Keth Mor's story is that he was completely forgotten. No written records preserve his name. No ancient text celebrates his achievement. Thousands of years after his death, when writing systems finally emerged, human societies had already internalized the calendar as something so fundamental that its origin seemed natural rather than invented. Modern historians can piece together that calendar systems emerged gradually across various cultures, but the evidence suggests that one crucial innovation occurred in one particular place. The carving of systematic calendars on stone surfaces, the coordination of these calendars across tribal boundaries, and the spiritual and social infrastructure that emerged around this innovation. The traces of this innovation point to a location somewhere in Central Asia, or the Caucasus region, sometime around 23,000 years ago. But the name of the innovator is lost to history. This is perhaps fitting. Keth Mor sought not to become famous, but to solve a practical problem, the human failure to remember. He succeeded so completely in externalizing memory, in removing the dependence on human recall, that his own name could be forgotten by history, and his calendar would persist nonetheless. Conclusion. The first prisoner of time. Keth Mor was not the first human to observe the cycles of nature. Every human society had shamans and medicine keepers who tracked seasons and astronomical events. What made Keth Mor revolutionary was his decision to make time visible, to create external representations that could be consulted, verified, and shared. In doing so, he solved a problem that every human society had struggled with since consciousness itself emerged: how to coordinate complex activities across time and across groups. He created the foundation for civilization itself. Every calendar you have ever used is descended from his innovation. Every plan made with reference to dates and seasons stands on the foundation he built. Every form of complex human organization, from ancient empires to modern corporations, depends fundamentally on the calendar system that Keth Mor invented. The next time you look at a calendar, consider that you are looking at technology that emerged not from writing, not from mathematics, not from philosophy, but from one old man's desperate need to remember. Keth Mor had forgotten his own age, and in his desperation to recover what was lost, he created the most powerful tool for human coordination and civilization that any individual human has ever invented. He did not conquer the world. He did not build monuments. He did not write books. He simply looked at the patterns in nature, recognized that human memory was inadequate to preserve them, and created an external system that could. In that simple act, he transformed humanity from creatures living in an eternal present into beings capable of planning, predicting, and progressing. This is the story of the man who trapped time. This is the man who made civilization possible. This is Keth Mor, the forgotten revolutionary who saw that the fundamental human problem was not the harshness of nature or the weakness of the body, but the limitation of memory. And in solving the problem of memory, he solved the problem of time itself. And in solving the problem of time, he set humanity on the course that would eventually take us to the stars.